Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Human Rights Magazine. I'm Derek McCush, editor of the Upstream Journal and of this podcast. This episode follows on the previous one in the Pathways to Peace series, which focused on the situation of human rights defenders. They're often people coming into conflict with corporate interests, particularly in extractive industries like mining. To explore the role of business in a peace-building process, I spoke with John Morrison, who has been Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Human Rights in Business since its beginning in 2009. The Institute states that its mission is to shape policy, advance practice, and strengthen accountability in order to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. I asked John if he could give an overview of how business fits into the big picture of achieving peace, and in particular, the relationship between business and human rights, given concerns that business activities may be more public image than substantive in terms of social responsibility and human rights, along with challenges such as the complexity of supply chains. I asked for his thoughts on whether it's really possible to ensure good behavior.
What's interesting about business and human rights, perhaps, is maybe we could argue that's where human rights started way back. Clay tablets from Persia and Babylon, etc., that seem to catalogue transactions and the rights of the marketplace. Arguably, the Cyrus Scroll and other things are the oldest human rights. We call them human rights documents. With a sort of projection from now to then. But certainly, if we think about the slave trade and the fact that 300 years ago, was it 75% of the world's population were either in forced labor, servitude, or slaves? The economic systems of the world, and therefore business, has for much of history and in many places been premised on the abuse of rights. Right? Humans were an economic resource to be exploited, like natural resources, like animals, like trees, etc. And I guess it's an Enlightenment view of the past 250 years that humans are not a resource the same as any other resource. And I think we're in a place of history now where we see where that's come a lot further. And so I think when we think about human rights in business now, yes, we can think about it in the context of 1948 and the Universal Declaration and the international law that's come from the UN and the ILO. But particularly when you frame it around an issue like peace, right, and the prevention of conflict and issues of natural justice and things, there's a much deeper relationship, I think, between non-state actors like business and society. Business is society. Society is business. It's an artifice, perhaps, in the way that we've constructed modern corporations today to pretend that they don't have responsibilities for human rights in the way that other actors do. So I sometimes think that the business and human rights movement of the past 20 years, which has focused a lot around sort of the extractive sector and the apparel supply chains that span the globe, is a correction to a much deeper, sort of almost intuitive understanding that, of course, corporations have human rights responsibilities. When did we ever get to a point when we thought that they didn't? So we've arrived at a place now where the international community have recognized that businesses have a direct responsibility to prevent harms, and to take active steps to build their leverage to minimize that risk. And they should categorize, they should prioritize human rights harms that they themselves cause. Then the secondary consideration are those to which they contribute. And then there's sort of a wider responsibility, a tertiary sphere, if you like, around linkage, human rights issues to which they're directly linked in their wider supply chain, etc. And this has now become an international norm. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are fundamentally a governance document. that bring the duties of states and the responsibilities of business into the same framework, which is primarily about prevention, but it's also about the responsibility to provide remedies when bad things happen. The business and states both have a shared responsibility for the delivery of adequate remedies. So it's out there as a norm. And what I think is now is that we have this normative framework that is lapping up at the same shores of our intuitive sense. Has it really got into the boardroom? Not yet. I'm co-chairing the World Economic Forum's Council on Human Rights at the moment, and our big focus is to get this into boardrooms. It's not yet a duty for the people who have the fiduciary and legal responsibilities for companies to have human rights responsibilities, but I think that day is coming. The European Commission is moving in that direction at the moment, and I think in other jurisdictions we're seeing governments thinking about mandating diversity and other responsibilities to board directors. And I think if you're a smart director of a company, you're not going to wait for law to come and tell you you need to do this. It's common sense. And we're beginning to see already, sometimes it's shareholders, sometimes it's just society responding in very strong ways to companies that are mucking up, either through, huge mining disasters we've seen in Brazil and elsewhere. But an example I point to a lot is Rio Tinto's decision to blow up a native Australian heritage site that's 46,000 years old. Humans only got to Australia, it's 50-odd thousand years ago. So one of the oldest archaeological monuments and something of direct living meaning to native Australians was blown up by Rio Tinto in its mining operations. Inadvertently, I'm sure, but it happened nevertheless. And now, several board members have resigned. The CEO was fired. No one died. But, the senior management of the company was removed and many board members, and for the first time ever, they now have a native Australian board member too. And I think that really does illustrate that these issues of human rights, even in cases where no one is dying, it's a cultural rights issue, but it's become so salient now that the company knows that it has to change. It has to change in its governance and who sits on the highest table in the company. So I think, although the normative framework emerged 10 years ago, maybe the next 10 years we're going to see human rights get into the DNA of companies. The just transition processes we're going to see around climate change as well, and climate justice, and these things are also going to demand that. So although, I think the next 10 years will show some dramatic shift in the way that corporations have to begin to align themselves, not just with the diktats of the marketplace or of investors, but also social and environmental expectations. And we talk about ESG a lot, environmental social governance. There's not a bank on the planet now that doesn't have an ESG policy. Of course, the S in ESG often gets overlooked, so the human rights side is the weakest. But that is changing. And who knows, in the next 10 years, it really might be the case that the social and environmental behavior of a company will be as important as its financial behavior.
This kind of positive transformation assumes a degree of transparency, access to information, and some level of accountability within a corporate structure. There are corporations out there, of course, that aren't concerned with ESG, and there are strong, growing economies like China on one hand and Western social pressure to improve on the other, along with merger regulations like the EU due diligence legislation. I asked to what extent we need that regulation to happen alongside of social pressure.
I'm not a lawyer, but I teach international law, and I'm a firm believer in law, but I think the most important thing here is there's a shift in behavior and impact in people's lives, right? We've got to think about what we're aiming at here is a better enjoyment of rights around the world and less frequent violation of those rights. Now, I believe that if we're talking about peace, the biggest threat to peace in the world today and in the 20th century wasn't business, although business can be a big threat to peace, but governments and dictators, fascists and communists. And I mean, you just have to look even today, and I want to talk about Myanmar because we have a center in Myanmar. It's one of the countries we work in, and we're right in the middle of this nexus. So I still think it holds true that it's state actors that are the biggest threat to peace, or the absence of effective state actors, and therefore chaos, and thugs and corrupt businesses, right, as well. So I think there needs to be much stronger law, and the discussions in the UN over the past 5 years for a binding international treaty on business and human rights are important, but they also illustrate how difficult and complex the process will be at the current time. But I would argue that making human rights due diligence mandatory for companies around the world is such a small step. If we're talking about peace and stability in the absence of harm, if you look at the review of the French law, which has been there for 2 years, a recent article I read, a report I read that reviewed the behavior of 103 French companies, these mandatory due diligence reports are only getting to senior management 20% of the time, and at board level even less. So this is a box ticking approach. And so the danger of law, if the law is not framed in the right way, and I'd say the UK Modern Slavery Act is another example of this. That's law, but it's law that's resulted in ticking boxes. And most of the companies that report under the UK Modern Slavery Act know that there is a strong probability of the risk of slavery in their global supply chain if they have a global supply chain. How many of them say that in their modern slavery reports? Virtually none, because corporate lawyers won't allow companies to talk about that theoretical risk because of the risk of liability. So we have this silly game that's going on at the moment. So definitely we need stronger legal accountability, but we've got to be super smart about what that legal accountability looks like.
If we are to be cautious about the role of the state in ensuring good corporate behavior, how do we build greater social awareness and popular support of the importance of human rights in corporate behavior as part of a broader peace-building process?
One area where we have made progress as a movement over the past 25, 30 years has been around the transparency of the extractive sector. If we think about blood diamonds, the Kimberley process, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, honestly, those sectors are better places in terms of their human rights behavior than was the case of 30 years ago. In fact, 30 years ago, I would say there was a business case to support corrupt governments, to pay bribes. That was the business case for doing deals in those countries, or every country. I'm not saying those countries. I mean, that includes Canada and the UK, I would say. That's turned on the head, not wholly, but in part. And that, I would say, has been primarily because of transparency requirements through the whole value chain. And I think we need more of that. So the thing I'm worried about lots of things, but one of the things I'm worried about is the rush to renewables. And that's a good thing, right? But, some people have predicted we're going to need 300% more copper out of the ground by 2050. More copper out of the ground than has ever been taken out of the ground since the Bronze Age. We're going to see, huge amounts of lithium, cobalt, rare earth metals, etc. We know where these minerals are. People now want to also prospect the Arctic and indigenous lands, the seabed, etc., for the green utopia. And it's needed. I mean, we know that the climate change is an existential risk, but it's at times like this where there's a strong overriding reason to take shortcuts and move quickly where big mistakes can be made. And it's not just like a global supply chain for these rare earth metals. We're also moving into a period of time where governments and companies want to securitize their supply on these things. So it's not enough. If half the world's copper is smelted in China, that isn't going to satisfy Western governments. that they have security of supply on copper, even though the copper's there. So they then have to explain to indigenous peoples, we need this mine in your land, not because there's a global shortage of copper, but there's a global shortage of copper under our control. And this is the world we're moving into. So I think what we need is radical transparency on the transition in to the green economy and the transition out of the high carbon economy, where also huge mistakes can be made in terms of the dumping of assets back onto governments and mass unemployment and the negatives that can happen from a human rights perspective there as well. Clarity about who is selling what to whom, where the provenance, the traceability of commodities. Very few commodities are traceable apart from the big diamonds. We have now, with blockchain and DNA, we're beginning to get to the point where you can get full traceability for most. Well, we haven't, and I think we're in the next 10 years we'll be able to deliver much greater transparency, both in terms of money but also the flow of commodities, and then that will enable an indigenous group or a local community to say, you don't really need that mine, do you? Or maybe you do need the mine, but do you really need it here? Or if now we get it, there is a need for a mine. Maybe this is the best place, but we want some equity in that. And it gives them negotiating power over free, prior, and informed consent.
John gave an example of the dynamic between state and business interests by discussing the engagement of the Institute for Human Rights in Business in Myanmar.
And Myanmar is a great case. I mean, it's a terribly sad case study, but it's a good case study to look at. We established the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business in 2013. We got into the country even before sanctions were lifted. 6 European governments support it. The idea is to track the activities of all international companies coming in, including Chinese and Asian companies, and to make doing the right thing in terms of human rights and responsible business a pre-competitive issue. And I think, ironically, we were able to achieve that. And then there was genocide in Rakhine State 3 years ago, and now there's been a coup. And what's interesting, Telenor, the big Norwegian telecommunications company, was criticized when it invested in Myanmar in 2013, 2014. Now there's a complaint to the Norwegian government about Telenor leaving Myanmar, because the realization is, of course, that when international companies that have made commitments to human rights leave a country like Myanmar that's facing COVID, an unvaccinated population with very little protection and a military coup and nascent civil war, when the international players leave, you're left with even less leverage in terms of human rights. So it really does sort of bookend. If you're thinking about the role of business in peace, yes, you do need business there. You do need businesses that are there to do the right thing, right? But when the businesses leave, that's even more problematic, but particularly when they sell on to a Lebanese private equity company that might then flip the assets to the Burmese military, which we're all terrified of at the moment. So the issue of business and human rights, is really complex. It is about how businesses behave, but it's the leverage that businesses have over governments and other actors that is really critical when we think about it from a peace perspective.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.